Chapter I. Blood on the Tree Line. The border province had no proper name anymore. Maps called it a march, a buffer, a line drawn in ink that men pretended could hold back the north. Those who lived there called it the edge. Beyond it lay the chaos wastes, where the sky curdled and the land remembered older, fouler truths. Here, the world was already fraying. The disappearances began quietly. A logging camp failed to deliver its timber quota. A way station's signal fires went unlit for 3 nights in a row. A road warden patrol never returned from a routine circuit along the forest's edge. No screams carried on the wind. No survivors staggered back with wild tales. People simply vanished, leaving behind cold hearths, half-eaten meals, and tools dropped where hands had once held them. Tracks told a familiar story. Hooves split the frozen mud. Cloven, heavy, careless. The prints of something that did not fear pursuit. Beastmen, most assumed, or warbeasts driven down from the north by hungrier rivals. It was unpleasant, but not exceptional. This close to the chaos wastes, horror was part of the landscape. By the time the last logging camp was found abandoned, its trees felled but never hauled, its men gone without blood or struggle, the settlement council swallowed its pride and scraped together coin. They sent riders south to find killers who knew how to face the things that came out of the dark. The hunters arrived at dusk on the 4th day. They came scarred, ill-tempered, and armed like men expecting betrayal from the world itself. Their armor was mismatched. Old imperial plate hammered flat where it had once borne heraldry, mail patched with wire, leather boiled and restitched until it barely resembled hide. Their weapons were worse axes with nicked blades, swords blackened by old blood, pistols that smelled of fouled powder and desperation. They did not ask many questions. They listened to the council's trembling explanations with flat expressions and harder eyes. Disappearances, Beastmen signs, the forest called the Blighted Reaches, payment promised in silver and provisions, with a bonus if the threat was ended rather than merely driven off. The hunters accepted. They always did. Confidence clung to them like old blood. They had fought chaos spawn in ruins that should not exist, hunted mutants through plague pits, burned cultists out of villages that begged for mercy afterward. This was a job, nothing more. Go into the trees, kill what needed killing, come back poorer in friends and richer in scars. They crossed into the forest at first light. The Blighted Reaches loomed ahead, a wall of blackened trunks and choking undergrowth. The trees grew too close together, their branches knotted and clawed, leaves dark even in daylight. The air changed as soon as they stepped beneath the canopy. It thickened, heavy with rot and sap, carrying the copper tang of old blood and something sour beneath it like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. At first, the forest was merely hostile. Thorns tore at cloaks. Roots rose at ankle height to trip the unwary. The ground sloped and twisted, refusing to settle into predictable paths. Birds were absent. Even insects seemed scarce. Sound did not travel properly. The crack of a snapped twig died too quickly, swallowed by the mass of wood and leaf. Then came the subtler wrongness, paths bent when no one was looking. A hunter would swear the way ahead had been clear moments before, only to find himself pushing through fresh brambles that bit and bled. Trees leaned at odd angles, trunks bowed inward as if listening. More than once, one of the hunters turned sharply, certain something had moved just beyond sight, only to see nothing but bark and shadow. The howls began before midday. They came from far off at first, long, echoing calls that rose and fell with unsettling rhythm. Beastmen, surely. The sounds matched old memories, the raw hunger, the challenge, the promise of violence. Yet there was something off about them. The howls overlapped too neatly, answering one another like signals rather than cries. They carried intent, not frenzy. The hunters pressed on, weapons in hand now, movements tight and practiced. Jokes died in their throats. Even the most hardened among them felt the forest watching, weighing each step. They found the first body near a clearing that should not have been there. The trees parted abruptly, forming a rough circle of trampled earth and churned mud. The smell hit them before the sight blood gone sour, entrails exposed to cold air. A beastman lay at the center, its massive frame sprawled on its back, chest torn open as if by enormous claws. It was dead, unmistakably so. But it was not alone. More bodies hung at the edges of the clearing. A full patrol, 6, perhaps 7 each, nailed upright against tree trunks by thick, thorned roots that pierced flesh and bone alike. Arms were splayed wide, ribs crushed inward where the wood had tightened its grip. Antlers were snapped and twisted, some forced deep into bark as if hammered there by an invisible hand. The beastmen had been alive when it happened. Their faces were frozen in expressions of shock and rage. Tusked mouths stretched wide in silent bellows. One had nearly torn free its torso, half ripped open, entrails spilling, but the roots had grown thicker around it, digging deeper, strangling it slowly. This was not the work of blades, nor of fire, nor even of other beastmen. The hunters moved cautiously among the corpses. They prodded roots with spear tips and recoiled as the wood flexed, still faintly alive. Sap oozed where iron bit bark, dark and viscous like clotted blood. One of the hunters spat a curse. Another muttered a prayer that was half forgotten and wholly inadequate. Beastmen killed one another all the time. Territory disputes, dominance rituals, sacrifices to foul gods. But this was execution, methodical, deliberate. The forest had chosen these creatures and displayed them like warnings. Closer inspection revealed stranger details. The roots were not merely wrapped around the bodies. They had grown through them, bone fused to wood, muscle fibers threaded with creeping tendrils. In places, bark had split to reveal pulsing flesh beneath, as if the trees themselves had organs buried under their skin. One beastman's eyes were still open. They did not stare sightlessly. They tracked movement. A hunter raised his weapon instinctively, then froze as the eye twitched and burst, spilling black fluid down the creature's cheek. Whatever awareness had lingered within it died with a wet, final sound. Silence fell heavy over the clearing. This place did not reek of chaos worship. There were no runes carved into bark, no idols crusted with blood, no signs of ritual frenzy. Instead, there was order, a cruel, patient order, the kind that came from something that understood violence not as celebration, but as necessity. The hunters understood then, though none spoke it aloud. They were not hunting a creature. They were trespassing inside a thing. The forest shifted around them, subtle as a breath drawn in anticipation. Leaves rustled without wind. Roots creaked and tightened. Somewhere deeper within the reaches, the howls rose again, closer now, eager. Whatever ruled this place did not serve chaos blindly. It did not howl its devotion to the dark gods or revel in meaningless slaughter. It watched, it judged, and it had noticed them. Chapter 2. The Forest That Watches. The Blighted Reaches did not permit passage so much as it endured it. The hunters advanced in a tight wedge, blades out, boots sinking into loam that clutched like wet meat. Every step forward felt earned in pain. Vines slithered across the forest floor with a lazy, obscene patience, coiling around ankles and greaves, tightening when cut, as if offended. One hunter hacked through a creeper that had looped his sword arm, only for the severed length to thrash like a dying serpent, spraying sap that burned where it touched skin. The trees leaned closer the deeper they went, not swaying, listening. Their bark was split and puckered, scarred with growths that resembled old wounds healed wrong. Faces suggested themselves in knots and hollows, stretched mouths, closed eyes, leering expressions that vanished when stared at directly. The air pressed down, warm despite the cold season, heavy with the stink of rot and copper. Then the whispers began in earnest. At first they were indistinct, no more than the susurration of leaves rubbing together, but as the hours dragged on, they sharpened into words, names, promises, accusations, blasphemies muttered in the cadences of prayer. A hunter staggered suddenly, clutching his head as a voice crooned into his ear, whispering of strength and freedom, of the gods beyond the veil who rewarded devotion with power and flesh remade. He screamed when the whisper turned, laughing as it listed his sins with perfect clarity. Another hunter struck him hard across the mouth, breaking teeth, the blow snapping him back to the present. Blood spilled, steaming, onto roots that drank greedily. The forest answered violence with violence of its own. Roots erupted from the ground without warning, thick as arms, snapping upward with bone-cracking force. One smashed into a breastplate, denting steel inward until ribs folded and lungs burst. The man died, choking on his own blood, eyes bulging as the root dragged him screaming into the earth. His screams cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, grinding sound as soil closed over him. They hacked and burned their way forward, leaving a trail of gore and shattered wood. Pistols boomed in the close air, muzzle flashes strobing against bark slick with sap. Powder smoke clung low, stinging eyes, mingling with the reek of decay. Every discharge seemed to anger the forest further. Branches creaked and cracked overhead, raining splinters like shrapnel. They found the survivor in a thicket of black thorns. He had once been human, of that there was no doubt. What remained of him wore the rags of a woodsman, though the fabric had fused to skin in places, threads vanishing into swollen flesh. His legs were crushed and twisted, pinned beneath a fallen trunk that had grown through him rather than fallen upon him. Bark had split his torso open, ribs pried apart, organs exposed and threaded with thin white roots that pulsed faintly. He was still alive. His eyes snapped toward the hunters as they approached, pupils blown wide, sclera webbed with red. He laughed a high, broken sound that bubbled through blood. "It listens," he croaked. "It learns. They should have killed him immediately. They knew that." Mercy was a liability this close to the wastes, but something in his gaze, something lucid beneath the madness, stayed their hands. He babbled as they cut him free from the worst of the roots, screaming as wood tore from flesh. His blood ran black and sticky. He spoke of years in the forest, of hiding places that vanished overnight, of paths that led him back to the same tree again and again, no matter how he walked. He spoke of the trees bending closer when he prayed, of the ground warming when blood soaked into it. "It was just woods," he wept, "just trees. Then the north bled into it. Bit by bit, it drank it, it remembered." He convulsed, coughing up clots and sap. His fingers had grown stiff, joints swollen and knotted, nails thickened into something like bark. Roots twitched beneath his skin when he screamed. "It wants order," he whispered hoarsely. "Not the screaming kind, not the mad kind. It wants balance. Meat to mulch, blood to soil. It feeds the horned ones, grows them strong, makes them part of it." At the mention of beastmen, his eyes rolled back and he shrieked as something inside him snapped. His spine arched violently, vertebrae cracking. One hunter put a blade through his throat then, sawing until the head came free. Even decapitated, the body twitched for several long moments before going still. The forest seal. They did not linger. They could feel the place tightening around them now, like a fist closing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, chanting in half-remembered tongues. Names of the dark gods bled through the leaves, not in praise, but in accusation, as if the forest recited the litany of damnation carved into its memory. The beastmen came at dusk. They did not charge howling from the shadows as their kind usually did. They advanced in silence, horns and antlers scraping softly against branches. Their bodies were wrong, more wrong than any beastman had a right to be. Bark had grown over muscle in thick plates, splitting to reveal twitching sinew beneath. Antlers had fused with living wood, branching and leafed, dripping sap that steamed as it hit the ground. Their eyes glowed with a steady, knowing light. The first clash was catastrophic. A beastman slammed into the hunter's line with the force of a battering ram, its shoulder sheathed in knotted wood. Armor buckled. A man was hurled backward, spine snapping against a tree with a wet crack. Another fired point-blank into a snarling face, the shot tearing away half a skull, only for roots to burst from the wound, lashing outward, piercing his throat and pinning him upright as he drowned in his own blood. Steel rang, and Stucker's blades bit into bark flesh, hacking away chunks that bled sap and gore alike. The beastmen fought with brutal coordination, flanking, herding, driving the hunters into narrower ground. They did not roar praises to chaos. They fought like soldiers. One hunter was dragged down, clawed hands ripping his helmet free. Antlers punched through his abdomen, lifting him screaming into the air. The beastman tore him in half with a wrenching twist, spilling steaming organs onto roots that writhed eagerly to claim them. Fire bought them moments. A flask shattered, flames licking up a beastman's torso, charring bark and cooking flesh beneath. It howled, then not in pain, but in rage, as burning branches sprouted from its shoulders, and it charged blindly, setting the forest alight in pockets that smoldered and hissed. The forest did not burn easily. Roots surged up to smother flames, soil folding over embers like flesh closing over wounds. Smoke thickened, acrid and choking, reducing the world to shadows and blood-slick ground. The hunters retreated step by brutal step, killing and being killed, until the beastmen fell back as suddenly as they had come. Silence returned, broken only by the labored breathing of the survivors and the wet sounds of the forest feeding. That was when they realized the path behind them was gone. Where they had entered was now a wall of dense, interlocked trunks and thorn-choked undergrowth, grown impossibly thick in the span of minutes. The forest floor had risen and fallen, reshaping itself, erasing all trace of their route. No light filtered through that direction anymore, only shadow and the slow, patient creak of wood settling. Ahead, the trees thinned, not into safety, but into something worse. The air grew warmer, heavier. The whispers aligned into a single murmur, deep and constant, like a vast thing breathing. Sap ran freely here, pooling in hollows like blood in open wounds. The ground pulsed faintly beneath their feet. They understood then, with the clarity of men who had run out of choices. The forest was not driving them out, it was drawing them in, toward its heart. Chapter 3. Horns, Thorns, and Blood. The forest tightened around them, like a noose drawn slow. They ran because standing still meant dying, and even running only delayed it. The ground pitched and buckled beneath their boots, roots rising like grasping fingers, tripping and tearing. Fog spilled between the trees in choking sheets, warm and wet, stinking of sap and blood. Visibility collapsed to arm's length. Every breath tasted of rot. The first ambush came from above. A beastman dropped from the canopy without warning, its weight snapping branches as it crashed down amid the hunters. Antlers fused with living wood punched through a man's shoulder, pinning him to the ground. The creature howled as it landed, its bark-plated chest flexing, sap oozing from old scars. It tore its antlers free, ripping muscle and bone with a wet shriek, then stamped down, crushing the man's skull into the mud until teeth and brains burst outward like pulp. The hunters responded with reflexive brutality. A pistol roared, the shot blasting away a beastman's knee in a spray of splintered bone and bark. It fell screaming, its voice cut short as an axe buried itself deep in its throat. Blood and sap fountained together, coating the wielder's face in hot filth. More came. They poured out of the fog in numbers that defied sense, warbands crashing through brush, hooves churning the earth into slurry. Some charged headlong, others circled wide, herding the hunters into tighter ground. They moved with grim purpose, not frenzy. Their eyes glowed faintly through the haze, reflecting firelight like animal stars. The fighting became close and personal, the kind where distance vanished and every blow landed with consequence. Blades stuck in flesh and had to be wrenched free, spears punched into bellies only to be snapped by clawed hands. One hunter was tackled and dragged screaming into the fog, his cries cut off abruptly by a crunching sound that echoed far too long. They burst into a clearing slick with old blood. Stone markers ringed it, half sunken and overgrown, etched with symbols eroded into near meaninglessness. At the center lay a ritual pit, its edges crusted black with dried gore. Fresh bodies, human and beastman alike, were piled haphazardly nearby, limbs twisted, faces gnawed, roots threaded through the corpses, burrowing deep, pulsing as they fed. The beastmen surged from every side. A stampede thundered across the clearing, bodies slamming together, horns goring, hooves trampling fallen hunters into meat. One man was knocked flat and disappeared beneath the press, his screams turning into wet gargles as hooves shattered his ribs and drove his organs out through his mouth. Fire answered fire. A hunter hurled a burning charge into the mass. The explosion tore through beastmen in a blossom of heat and shrapnel, limbs flying, bark and flesh atomized. The blast hurled bodies into trees hard enough to embed them there. Twitching, flames licked across the clearing, but again the forest resisted. Roots surged, smothering embers, choking smoke, drinking heat as if it were nourishment. They fought back to back now, formation breaking down into desperate clusters. Blood slicked the ground, turning footing treacherous. A beastman lunged and was met by a sword thrust that punched through its chest and out its back, pinning it to a tree. It kept fighting, goring blindly, until its head was split open with a hammer blow that pulped brain and splintered antler alike. Between clashes, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a random infestation. The beastmen bore marks of cultivation, muscles overgrown and reinforced by wood, wounds that had healed into bark plates, veins threaded with roots that pulsed in time with the forest's murmur. When they fell, the ground claimed them immediately, roots tearing into corpses before blood had time to cool. The forest was farming them, growing them, using them as antibodies, unleashed whenever foreign flesh trespassed too deeply. Every death fed the soil. Every drop of blood was reclaimed. The realization curdled into something close to despair. Arguments broke out amid the carnage, shouted over the din of battle and the forest's endless whispering. One hunter screamed that the only solution was fire, real fire, the kind that burned for days, that turned everything it touched into ash and screaming smoke. Better to erase the reaches entirely, he ranted, even if the flames spread south and took settlements with them. Better dead villages than a living forest that learned. Another spat blood and shouted back that there was no burning this place, not with chaos sunk so deep into its roots. Fire would only wake worse things. They needed to escape. That was it. Survive or die. The argument ended when a beastman smashed through them. It was larger than the rest, its body a walking tangle of trunk and sinew, antlers branching like a crown of thorns. It hit like a falling tree. One hunter was caught mid-shout, his torso crushed between the creature's arms until his spine burst through his back. The beastman roared, lifting the corpse and tearing it apart lengthwise, showering the clearing in gore. They brought it down with everything they had. Shots blasted chunks from its body, axes hacked deep, sticking fast in living wood. A spear punched into its eye and drove through skull and brain, rooting it to the earth. Even then it thrashed, crushing a hunter's leg beneath its bulk before finally going still. The ground drank it in moments, roots snapping bones as they dragged it down. When the dust settled, fewer stood. Death came suddenly here, without warning or drama. A snapped neck, a horn through the throat, a root bursting up from beneath, impaling a man through the groin and out the mouth. The survivors learned not to look back too long, not to linger over screams. They pushed on because stopping meant becoming fertilizer. The forest guided them now, corridors opening only where it wished them to go, herding them through kill zones and ritual scars. They passed groves where beastmen knelt in eerie silence, heads bowed, bodies half fused to trees as if mid-transformation. They passed pits where warbeasts were grown, hulking shapes cocooned in wood and flesh, breathing slow and deep, waiting to be unleashed. The whispers were no longer subtle. They spoke as one voice now, deep and patient, promising release through surrender, through stillness, through becoming part of the whole. Names of gods bled together into a chant that felt less like worship and more like inevitability. Another ambush, another brutal clash, another body down. A hunter took a blade through the gut, spilling intestines that tangled with roots even as he fell. He screamed as the forest claimed him alive, roots threading through his organs, pulling him apart piece by piece, while he begged his comrades to kill him. They could not reach him in time. By the time they stumbled onward, blood-soaked and exhausted, heroism was a memory that belonged to other men in other places. There was no glory here, no righteous stand, only the grim arithmetic of survival, steps taken, breaths drawn, lives spent to buy minutes more. They were being bled dry, and the forest was far from finished with them. Chapter 4. Escape from the living hell. The heart of the Blighted Reaches throbbed like an exposed organ. They emerged into it through a narrowing corridor of trees that peeled back reluctantly, bark splitting with wet cracks as if flesh were being torn from bone. The air was hot here, close and damp, reeking of blood, rot, and something older, an animal musk layered with the acrid tang of chaos. The ground pulsed beneath their boots, rising and falling in a slow, obscene rhythm. The grove was vast, far larger than it had any right to be. Trees had fused together into towering pillars of wood and meat, their trunks swollen and veined, bark split open to reveal muscle that flexed and knotted. Roots rose above the surface like ribs, arching and interlocking to form a cathedral of corruption. Chaos runes burned faintly across bark and flesh alike, not carved but grown, their shapes formed by scar tissue and twisted grain. At the center stood the core. It was not a tree. It was not entirely alive, nor entirely dead. A colossal mass of fused trunks spiraled upward, slick with sap and blood, its surface studded with half-absorbed skulls, human, beastmen, things older and less recognizable. Tendrils as thick as siege ropes writhed from its base, burrowing into the earth and dragging nourishment inward. The whispers were deafening here, a constant susurrus that clawed at the mind, promising unity, rest, purpose. This was the forest's will made flesh. The surviving hunters staggered into the grove, blood-soaked and barely standing. Armor hung in ruins. Weapons were nicked and broken, hands shaking with exhaustion and pain. They had lost track of how many had died. Numbers had ceased to matter. What mattered was that the thing before them could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. They did not speak of victory. They spoke of disruption, of hurting it enough to escape. They moved quickly, knowing the forest was already reacting. One hunter dragged out stolen pages from a forbidden tome, parchment stiff with dried blood and scribbled with counter-rituals half understood and wholly dangerous. Another primed charges black powder packed into iron shells, fuses trembling as they were lit. Others doused the roots with oil, thick streams soaking into pulsing flesh that quivered at the touch. The ritual began with screaming. Words meant to unmake were shouted into the grove, syllables tearing at throats and sanity alike. The runes on the core flared in response, burning brighter, bleeding light. The ground convulsed violently, throwing hunters off their feet. Roots lashed out, smashing bodies aside, snapping bones like kindling. The forest answered blasphemy with fury. Beastmen erupted from the surrounding growth, but these were not the war bands they had fought before. These were abominations, things grown hastily and cruelly. Limbs multiplied and fused, mouths split open along torsos, teeth gnashing blindly. Antlers burst through skulls in grotesque spirals, ripping flesh apart as they grew. One charged straight through a hunter, its body a living battering ram of wood and bone. The man exploded in a spray of gore, reduced to fragments that splattered across the core and were immediately swallowed by grasping tendrils. Another abomination vomited a stream of corrosive sap that ate through steel and flesh alike, leaving a hunter screaming as his skin sloughed from bone. The charges went off. Explosions tore chunks from the core, blasting away bark and meat in showers of burning debris. Sap sprayed like arterial blood, sizzling where it hit flame. The grove shook, a deep, agonized groan echoing through the forest as if the land itself screamed. Fire took hold, real fire this time. Flames crawled across oil-soaked roots, roaring upward, charring flesh and cracking wood. The core thrashed, tendrils whipping wildly, smashing pillars apart. A hunter was caught mid-stride, wrapped in living rope and dashed against a trunk until his body came apart in a wet smear. The ritual reached its climax. The hunter, chanting from the tome, collapsed to his knees, blood pouring from his eyes and ears as the words ripped him apart from the inside. He finished the final phrase anyway, screaming it into the ground as roots pierced his legs and dragged him down. The runes on the core flickered and warped, their shapes unraveling into meaningless scars. For a moment, a single, fragile moment, the forest faltered. That was enough. The ground began to collapse inward. roots snapping and tearing as the core convulsed. Trees toppled, smashing into one another, dragging beastmen down with them. Abominations were crushed beneath falling trunks or torn apart as the earth split open, swallowing them whole. "Run!" someone screamed. It barely mattered who. They ran. The forest came apart behind them in a howling storm of destruction. Corridors collapsed, paths twisting violently as the land reshaped itself in agony. Trees tore free from the earth, roots flailing, crashing down in avalanches of wood and flesh. Beastmen were ripped in half by shifting ground, their screams lost beneath the roar. One hunter stumbled, his leg shattered by falling debris. He begged, clawing at the mud as roots began to wrap around him. Another tried to pull him free and was crushed by a collapsing trunk. Both bodies flattened into indistinguishable ruin. Fire spread unchecked now, feeding on sap and rot, sending pillars of smoke clawing into the sky. The forest burned and bled and screamed, wounded but far from dead. The survivors burst from the tree line at last, staggering into cold, clean air as dawn broke over the frontier. Behind them, the blighted reaches churned and smoked, a wounded beast thrashing in its lair. Only a handful remained. They did not celebrate. They did not speak. They collapsed where they stood, coughing up blood, staring back at the forest that had nearly claimed them. The whispers faded with distance, but none believed they were gone for good. Weeks later, coin was pressed into their hands, silver darkened with old blood, counted quickly, without ceremony. No songs were sung, no tales spread. The council wanted silence as much as survival. The disappearances slowed. Camps were rebuilt farther from the trees. Life crept back to the edge, but the blighted reaches still stood, wounded, angry, remembering. In the Warhammer world, evil was rarely destroyed. It was endured, scarred, and left to fester until the world needed reminding of its presence again.